Let's turn to Facsimile 3. And the reason I suggest we go there first instead of Facsimile 2 is because Facsimile 3 was also owned by Hoare and was likely towards the end of this roll, or towards the end of at least the text of the Book of Breathings. This is a drawing that is typical to be associated with the Book of Breathings. Although I will say again that there are some elements that are very unique about this. We've had a master's thesis done on this recently, and he categorizes these drawings in general, and especially with the Book of Breathings. And there are a number of elements that are very, very unique about this. And so let's look at Facsimile 3. And then before we move on to Facsimile 2, I want to ask us, what can we learn about or learn from Facsimile 1 and Facsimile 2? What are some spiritual lessons that we could possibly learn from these? Facsimile 3, Joseph Smith, or whoever wrote that explanation, and Joseph Smith approves, is about Abraham sitting on the throne teaching Pharaoh astronomy. Fantastic story. Joseph Smith says that the glyphs above the figures tell us that. I'll be honest that these glyphs are almost impossible to read. When we try and translate them, we go to parallels, and that may or may not work well because, again, we're seeing unique elements here, so the parallels may not be helpful. But the way they read now, they don't seem to say that to me as an Egyptologist. I don't know if that's because we just aren't doing them correctly, or I suspect even more likely is that Joseph Smith understood how we should interpret these and made the assumption that that's what the glyph said. In the end, I don't know why we get that. But there's some really interesting things that are worth exploring about Facsimile 3. Before we do so, I again want to show you the metal plate. This is the plate that Reuben Hedlock made, that Facsimile 3 is made from. So we ask ourselves, what's going on here? What's being depicted in here? Many people would say that this was a judgment scene. Well, let's look at, are there other possible explanations? One explanation is that we have lots of ancient traditions that Abraham taught the Egyptians about astronomy. And that's interesting because that's what Joseph Smith tells us is going on here, and we read about that in Abraham chapter 3. But let's explore it as possibly a judgment scene. That would be interesting as well because we have, for example, an ancient tradition written in Egypt, seemingly by Christian Egyptians, but an ancient tradition called the Testament of Abraham, where you go through a typical Egyptian judgment scene, and it's Abraham that you see. It's actually Abraham who's seen the judgment scene. Abraham is associated by some Egyptians with judgment scenes. So that's interesting. Abraham sees the last judgment, and it really is based on a very typical Egyptian style of judgment scene. But I would argue that this really isn't a judgment scene. And here you can see pictures of a judgment scene, and it's very different. You always have this weighing of the heart and so on. So judgment scenes are different than what this is, but it's not completely wrong to say it's a judgment scene because typically in Egyptian depictions, you're successful. They don't draw a picture of someone being unsuccessful in a judgment scene. Who would buy a papyrus and said, I'm not successful in my judgment. So they're always successful in their judgment scene. And the very next step is to have the person presented before the throne of a god. And so that's what Facsimile 3 is similar with, or typical of, is this kind of being presented before a god. But in this case, Joseph Smith tells us that it's Abraham sitting on the throne reasoning upon astronomy. So again, that's interesting because we have a number of people who associate Abraham with teaching astronomy, but it's also interesting because we have found some of these scenes, very similar scenes, that usually will say that it's Osiris sitting upon his throne. But in some cases, and these are in Egypt, these are Egyptian scenes, that in some cases, instead they say it's Abraham or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sitting upon the throne. So this kind of drawing was associated with Abraham by ancient Egyptians. And I think that's worth thinking about. That's worth recognizing. So now let's ask ourselves, what can we learn from Facsimile 1 and Facsimile 3? And I'm sure there are more things that we can and should learn than what I'll be able to talk about here, or that even what I know or realize. And there are some things that we can learn when we put all three facsimiles together that we'll address at the very end of this section of Course 1. But I think that probably the greatest thing we learn from these facsimiles is from the story they depict. They depict fantastic stories. They depict Abraham being sacrificed because he was willing to preach against idolatry, knowing that it would be dangerous. They depict Abraham after he is being sacrificed because he was willing to preach against idolatry. They depict him supplicating God and being saved. Now, there's some difficult things in that story as well, because there's some other people who are sacrificed for the same reason that aren't saved. And that there's some great lessons in there. The idea that I personally think that Abraham is saved because he has a work to do. And remember, his life is just going to be hard after this. Those who were sacrificed were saved from a lot of hard stuff and were taken up to be with God. And so not everyone is saved in their trials. Ultimately, we all are, but not in the midst of it in the short term. But the fact that Abraham is saved and that he goes forth to do God's will, tremendous lessons in there. The fact that in Abraham chapter 3, Abraham is told to go preach the gospel to the Egyptians by teaching them about astronomy. We don't have the text that tells us he did that, but we have the drawing that tells us he did that. That Abraham was faithful to that. Not an easy thing to ask someone who's nearly been sacrificed by Egyptians to go and do. But he does. He goes down, and remember the whole story of going down there and Sarah and everything. But he does it. And he is blessed. He is so blessed that the Egyptians listen to him and they honor him and they put him on the throne and they learn from him. We learn about Abraham's faithfulness and how when he is faithful, God comes through for him and helps him be successful in the things he's trying to do. There are tremendous lessons that we learn from the facsimiles as we look at this storyline. I think it's just fantastic stuff.